Hello, everybody. How are you? This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. We're reading part 7 of The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. His essay was translated by Luigi Ricci. This is, as I said, part 7. We've read the first 6 parts. Hopefully you read it with me. And now we're going to begin. Let's begin. It's very exciting. Chapter 18. In what way princes must keep faith. Remember who's he writing it to? Lorenzo de' Medici, otherwise known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. And why is he writing this to Lorenzo? Because he doesn't have riches or horses to offer the new prince, and he wants to offer him something that will benefit him. So Machiavelli, having studied power in history and how people get power, maintain power, or lose power, he put it down in writing in one of the most famous classical books ever written called The Prince. So in what way princes must keep faith? Let's go. How laudable it is for a prince to keep good faith and live with integrity, and not with astuteness, everyone knows. Still, the experience of our times shows those princes to have done great things who have had little regard for good faith and have been able, by astuteness, to confuse men's brains, and who have ultimately overcome those who have made loyalty their foundation. He's telling us that, well, yeah, good faith might have good faith, but it's been guys who don't do that, who through astuteness, cleverness, confuse men's brains. Let's see what Machiavelli says about that. You must know then, you, who's you? That's a pronoun. Who's he talking to? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Lorenzo de' Medici. You must know, Lorenzo, then, that there are 2 methods of fighting. One by law and the other by force. Tell me that's... I have to take a deep breath, ladies and gentlemen. One by law and the other by force. The first method is that of men, and the second of beasts. But as the first method is often, notice the little red arrows. Remember what Jimmy does is he gives you a clue on what to take notes of. There's an arrow here pointing to this paragraph and here too, and that's one we're going to talk about in our analysis. And then note the EG. We're going to get to that in a minute. Usually Machiavelli gives examples to prove what he believes and what he says when he's telling Lorenzo. But as to the first method, that of really by law, is often insufficient. One must have recourse to the second. Now, who's he telling this to again? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Lorenzo. He's also telling it to any CEO, anybody who's run employees. He's telling this to parents. He's telling this to teachers. He's telling this to police officers. He's telling this to everyone who understands how power is gained, retained, and lost. Since you fight by law or force, the first method, by law, is often insufficient. So you have to have recourse to the second. It is therefore necessary for a prince to know well how to use both the beast and the man. This is a very interesting statement. This was covertly taught to rulers by ancient writers, Homer, etc., who relate how Achilles and many others of those ancient princes were given to Charon, the centaur, to be brought up and educated under discipline. Now, what is this a reference to? This is called an allusion to Greek mythology. Remember, Jimmy told you the more you read, the better you're off, and there's a lot of references to Greek mythology, to the Bible, etc., etc., etc. And so a well-read person who's trying to read the classics should have this under their belt. Somebody emailed me the other day, and I provided a list of what I believe you need in order to understand classical literature. It's a list that has served me well, that I built in my study of classical literature. And if you're interested in that list, drop me an email, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, and I'll send you the list. In any case, he's talking about Charon, the centaur. You know what a centaur is? It's a half man, half horse. And Achilles and many other ancient princes were given to the centaur to be brought up, to learn how to fight as a man and as a beast. Now, it's interesting about this man-beast thing. We're going to talk about that in an analysis. The parable of this semi-animal, semi-human teacher is meant to indicate, says Machiavelli, that a prince must know how to use both natures, and that the one without the other is really not durable. So either if you're too much fighting like a man under the law, that's not durable. You got to know how to do both. How to do both. More importantly, ladies and gentlemen, when to do the one over the other. So a prince, says Machiavelli, being thus obliged to know well how to act as a beast, must imitate the fox and the lion. And for the lion cannot protect himself from traps, but the fox cannot defend themselves from wolves. So there's animal. He's giving you animal examples, right? Lions fall into traps because they're not as clever as the fox. So one must therefore be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten wolves. This guy's smart. Those that wish to be only lions do not understand this, right? Force makes right. I'll just force them to do it. Nah. Therefore, pay attention. There's the arrow. A prudent ruler ought not to keep faith when by doing so it would be against his interests. Remember, the title of this section is In What Way Princes Should Keep Faith. What does that mean? Keep faith. Be loyal. A prudent ruler, again, Machiavelli says, ought not to keep faith when by doing so it would be against his interests. And when the reasons which made him bind himself no longer exist. Uh-oh! Is he saying not to be loyal? Pay attention. If men were all good, this precept would not be a good one. But as men are bad and would not observe their faith with you, you're not bound to keep faith with them. Wow. That sounds reciprocal, isn't it? That's like when you do a deal, right? You keep your word. You don't keep your word if the other person doesn't keep their word. That's something to think about. These arrows are meant for you to keep in mind this, write them down, stop me, pause me, write them down, and think about them. Not just accept them as true, but to think about them. Nor have legitimate grounds ever failed a prince who wished to show colorable excuse for the non-fulfillment of his promise. Of this, one could furnish an infinite number of modern examples and show how many times peace has been broken. Ain't that the truth? And how many promises rendered worthless by the faithlessness of princes. And those that have been best able to imitate the fox have succeeded the best. But it is necessary to be able to disguise this character well, and to be a great feigner and dissembler. Pay attention. Let me repeat that. It's necessary to be able to disguise this character. What character? Being a fox. A lot of times I would tell people in my office, I'm acting ignorant, even though I will know the answer to the question, but I just act ignorant. Not because I'm a fox, but because I'm a fox. You don't necessarily know. You want to tell everything, that you know to everybody. You don't have to prove you know everything. In fact, people who try to prove that they know everything probably don't know as much as you think they know. And men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. Let me repeat that. Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. You know, you talk about in these days fraud over the phone, right? Taking advantage of, for example, senior citizens, cybercrime, all that stuff. You know, look up some of the great crimes of the century in cybercrimes. Bernie Madoff is a great example. People believed him. And people who believed him were deceived eventually, and he went to jail. I think he's still in jail. I put a little double exclamation point. There's a sucker born every minute is a phrase closely associated with P.T. Barnum and Bailey Circus. There's a sucker born every minute. Is that the philosophy you want to follow? It may not be the philosophy you want to follow, but Niccolo Machiavelli is telling Lorenzo that you better learn how to be a fox, right? If you're going to survive as a prince. I will only mention one modern instance, he says. Alexander VI did nothing but deceive men. He thought of nothing else, and he found the occasion for it, and no man was ever more able to give assurances or affirm things with stronger oaths, and no man observed them less. However, Alexander VI always succeeded in his deceptions, as he well knew this aspect of things. What does that mean? He knew that men will, they're willing to be deceived. They don't see through the bull. It is not, and sometimes, isn't that true? We want to believe things, pardon me. So when people tell us stuff and we've really wanted to believe that, we believe that despite the evidence in front of our own eyes. Despite that, right? The example I'm thinking of now is COVID. If you examine what happened to this country during COVID, and you think about what's going on today, and you go back in time and you look at that, which is the advantage of going back in time, right? From the present, that's what you study history for. You can see what it was all BS. It was all BS. Not the virus, but the reaction to the virus was just wrong. Wrong. We were all deceived. We were all suckers. That's Jimmy's opinion. You don't have to believe me. It is not therefore necessary for a prince to have all the above named qualities, being a fox and a lion, etc., but it is very necessary to seem to have them. Jimmy wrote a note here, seem versus is. You know, there's a big difference in classical literature that I told you if you've been reading with me for some time. There's a big difference between seeming to be a good person and being a good person. You understand? You seem to be, you are. There's a big difference between seeming and are, right? So he's telling Lorenzo, it's very necessary to seem to have these qualities. You got to be a pretender. Well, Jimmy, isn't that being a hypocrite? Well, is it? Is it? Are you being hypocritical if you know you're not a fox, but you're trying to be a fox? You're trying to be clever? You got to keep people on their toes. If you're the prince and people are sucking up to you, how do you know who to believe? Anybody who's ever been a boss understands that. Anybody, if you've been a teacher and any person in authority knows that. People tell you things because they know what you want to hear. Ask any prisoner who's trying to get a pardon. He's going to tell the parole board exactly what they want to hear, not necessarily what he believes. Well, how do you know when it's true? Well, you don't, do you? You have to have trust. You have to look at the evidence. That's what Machiavelli's telling the prince, that you have to really project being a prince and keep people on their toes because they're going to be sucking up to you. He's going to talk about that in a few chapters. He continues, I would even be bold to say that to possess them, the qualities, and always to observe the qualities is dangerous, but to appear to possess them is very useful. Because let's face it, if you're really a beast, if you're an animal, well, what kind of prince are you going to be if you don't have that? In other words, you got to jump outside yourself. You can't be one or the other. You got to be one or the other at the time you need to be one or the other. Well, Jimmy, that's schizophrenia. No, it's not. Not if you're aware of it. If you are aware of what you're doing when you're doing it, it has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with schizophrenia, which is an illness. You understand? Thus, it is well to seem merciful, seem faithful, seem humane, sincere, religious, and also to be so. But you must have the mind so disposed that when it is needful to be otherwise, you may be able to change to the opposite qualities. Do you understand what he's saying there? There's a big red arrow there. Big red. See that? See that? Look at all these arrows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 8 arrows on this one section. 9 if you count the top one. Ho! I'm going to reread this. You have a mind disposed when it is needful to be otherwise, to be able to change to the opposite quality. And it must be understood that a prince, and especially a new prince, cannot observe all those things which are considered good in men, being often obliged, in order to maintain the state, and to act against faith, against charity, against humanity, and against religion. And therefore, he, the prince, must have a mind disposed to adapt itself according to the wind. Now, I'm going to stop there and pause there for a moment and say, well, isn't that kind of flighty? Don't we criticize people who change their mind in what they call these days a flip-flop in their opinion? I want you to think about this, because I'm not telling you you have to believe what Machiavelli's saying, but I assure you Machiavelli is saying this for a reason, and you better figure it out before you reject it. You cannot reject it outright, because the truth is, you believe things until evidence tells you not to believe them otherwise. And if you still believe them, despite the evidence, then you're just plain nuts. You have to change. Change is one of the governing principles of the universe, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't figured that out. As Marcus Aurelius says, you can't step in the same river twice, or was it Heraclitus? One of those great philosophers, right? You can't do it. Things change. So if you believe something and then suddenly the evidence tells you that what you believe is incorrect, that after, proven, but now it's incorrect, and you don't change your mind, you keep saying, no, I'm right, then you're just nuts. Then it's going to lead to ruin. So Machiavelli's telling Lorenzo, adapt yourself according to the wind. And as the variations of fortune dictate, and as I said before, not deviate from what is good if possible. In other words, be good if possible, but you have to be able to do evil if constrained. That's a bold statement. Do you believe that? Would you do that? Would you commit evil if you had to? No, Jimmy, I'd never. Geez, I'd avoid that like the plague. Well, situations change. That's what he's saying. If fortune dictates. If you were confronted on the street with your child and someone was threatening your child, what would you do? Turn the other cheek? What would you do? Or your loved one. Doesn't have to be a child. What would you do? If possible, but be able to do evil if constrained. He continues, a prince must take great care that nothing goes out of his mouth which is not full of the above-named 5 qualities. And to see and hear him, he should seem to be all mercy, faith, integrity, humanity, and religion. There's your 5 qualities. Mercy, faith, integrity, humanity, and religion. And nothing is more necessary than to seem to have this last quality, religion. For men in general judge more by eyes than by hands. For everyone can see, but very few have to feel. Do you understand that? You judge by your eyes. You see things. You see what people do. You see what people react in a time of crisis. If a crisis happens or you see something going on, the way that people act in a crisis, that tells you more things than you feel. You might not be able to feel it, but you can see it. You can see it. You know the story of doubting Thomas, right? The apostle after Christ rose. If you believe, you don't have to believe it, but you need to understand the story. It's classical literature. Doubting Thomas did not believe that Christ rose from the dead. That's why he's called Doubting Thomas. He says, I'm not going to believe it, and I put my fingers in the guy's wounds because he was crucified, right? So when he did do that, and Jesus came to him and he put his hands in, Jesus says, I heard what you said. Here, he took his hand and put them in his wounds, in his side, in his hands, and then he believed. Seeing is believing, right? Otherwise, you got to have faith, you got to trust. But he's telling the prince, people will believe what they see, not what they necessarily feel. Everybody can hate you, but if suddenly you do a good deed, everybody says, well, wait, maybe I shouldn't hate you. Everybody sees what you appear to be. Why didn't I highlight appear? Seems to be. Few feel what you are. Isn't that the truth? Oh, look at this guy. He's just an old codger, right? Hey, what does he know? Few people feel what you are. And those few will not dare to oppose themselves to the many. So if everybody's against you, they're not going to stand up who have the majesty in the state to defend them. And in the actions of men, and especially princes, from which there is no appeal, the end justifies the means. There's an arrow there, the end justifies the means. In the actions of men, especially princes, people in power, there is no appeal. The end justifies the means. We're going to talk a lot about that, because do you believe that? That means if the end justifies the means, well, if I want this end, that means I can use any means I want. Let a prince, therefore, aim at conquering and maintaining the state, and the means will always be judged honorable and praised by everyone, for the vulgar is always taken by appearances and the issue of the event. And, note, the world consists only of the vulgar, and the few who are not vulgar are isolated when the many have a rallying point in the prince. In other words, if the prince maintains loyalty to himself, it doesn't matter what these few vulgar people are going to say, right? A certain prince of the present time, whom it is well not to name, never does anything but preach peace, good faith, but he is really a great enemy of peace and good faith, and either of them. And he has observed them, and if he had observed being peaceful and faithful, he would have lost him the state and the reputation on many occasions. Now, who the hell is he talking about? My guess, my research, Pope Alexander VI. So he's pretended to be peace. I love peace and good faith. But if he observed them, he would have lost his position of power. These are very important things to consider, ladies and gentlemen. Very important issues. Now, I've gotten emails already, and we're going to go over that too when we analyze things, that people don't necessarily believe this guy. And that's fine. You don't have to believe him. What you have to believe is your own eyes. So look, I urge you, I encourage you, look around yourself in the world today and ask yourself what's going on. Is Machiavelli right or is he wrong? There's a certain country that just happened today, or like last night, that fell. The guy's been in there for maybe 20 years, and he was overthrown. He was absolutely thrown out, and he escaped, right? He abandoned his country. I'm not going to mention any names because I don't want to date myself. but he was forced out. It wasn't by illegal means. He was forced out. So Machiavelli telling you you're going to fight by the law or not by the law, by force, is still true. Is still true. It's a Middle Eastern country, yes. Chapter 19. Okay. That we must avoid being despised and hated. You think? But as I have now spoken of the most important of the qualities in question, I will now deal briefly and generally with the rest. The prince must, as already stated, avoid all those things which will make him hated or despised. And whenever he succeeds in this, in making himself not hated or despised, he will have done his part and will find no danger in the other vices. He will chiefly become hated, as I said, by being rapacious and usurping, greedy, if he was greedy, and usurping the property and the women of his subjects. That's when he will be hated, which he must abstain from doing. So he's telling you, so don't be greedy. Don't start taking property or women. And whenever one does not attack the property or honor or the generality of men, they will live contented. And one will only have to combat the ambition of a few, who can be easily held in check in many ways. He is rendered despicable. Remember, he's talking about hated or despised. So the prince is rendered despicable by being thought changeable, frivolous, effeminate, timid, irresolute. Well, Jimmy, didn't we just say that you should never change your mind, right? Oh, no. We didn't say you should never change your mind. Machiavelli's saying you should change your mind. Well, that's what he's saying here, Jimmy. If you're changeable, you're going to be thought to be despised. They're going to despise me if I change my mind. Well, that's one thing. But if you change your mind for a reason, right, he's saying that's okay. So a prince must guard against as a rock of danger. What? Against all these things. Being thought changeable, frivolous, effeminate, timid, and irresolute. And to contrive that his actions show grandeur, spirit, gravity, and fortitude. And as to the government of his subjects, let the sentence be irrevocable. Let his sentence be irrevocable. In other words, you sentence a guy to death, don't change your mind. You sentence a guy to the irons, to the prison, don't change your mind. And let him adhere to his decision so that no one may think of deceiving or cozening him. Right? Jimmy has a saying that's a truth in the universe. I'll share it with you now if you want to write it down, which is really almost what Machiavelli's saying. Once you begin a gesture, it's fatal not to carry it through. Should I repeat that? Once you begin a gesture, it's fatal not to carry it through. So the corollary is, be careful what you start. And that's what Machiavelli's saying here. Let your sentence be irrevocable. The prince who creates such an opinion of himself gets a great reputation. And it is very difficult to conspire against one who has a great reputation. And he will not easily be attacked so long as it is known that he is capable and reverenced by his subjects. For a prince must have two kinds of fear. One internal, as regards to his subjects, and one external, as regard to foreign powers. Pay attention. A prince must have two kinds of fear. One internal, as regards his subjects, and one foreign powers. And from the latter, he can defend himself with good arms and good friends. Remember, Machiavelli preaches to have your own army. And he will always have good friends if he has good arms. And internal matters will always be quiet if they are not perturbed by conspiracy, and there is no disturbance from without. And even if external powers sought to attack him, if he has ruled and lived as I have described, he will always if he stands firm, be able to sustain every shock. As I have shown in Nabis, there's the example, the Spartan did. Why didn't I put the EG there? There's an EG, example, right? But with regard to the subjects, if not acted on from the outside, it is still to be feared lest they conspire in secret, from which the prince may guard himself well by avoiding hatred and contempt, and keeping the people satisfied with him, when it is necessary to accomplish, as has been related at length. And one of the most potent remedies that a prince has against conspiracies is that of not being hated by the mass of people. For whoever conspires always believes that he will satisfy the people by the death of the prince. You see what he's saying? So if the prince has guarded himself and is loved by the people, there's no chance of a conspiracy succeeding. But if he thought to offend them by doing this, he would fear to engage in such an undertaking, for the difficulties that the conspirators have to meet are infinite. Experience shows that there have been many conspiracies, but few have turned out well. Note the arrow. For whoever conspires cannot act alone, and cannot find companions except from among those who are discontented. And as soon as you have disclosed your intention to a malcontent is such a great underutilized word, right? Sometimes the equivalent in modern days is called a whiner. Do you know any whiners? As soon as you have disclosed your intention to a malcontent, you give him the means of satisfying himself, for by revealing it, he can hope to secure everything he wants. Oh, Mr. Prince, or Lorenzo, did you know? To such an extent that seeing a certain gain by doing this, and seeing, on the other hand, only a doubtful one and full of danger, he must either be a rare friend to you, or else a very bitter enemy to the prince if he keeps faith with you. And to express the matter in a few words, I say that on the side of the conspirator, there is nothing but fear, jealousy, suspicion, and the dread of punishment which frightens him. But on the side of the prince, there is the majesty of government and the laws and the protection of friends and of the state which guard him. You see, this is so well put. When to these things, if added the goodwill of the people, it is impossible that anyone should have the temerity to conspire. Well, you can't do it. For whereas generally a conspirator has to fear before the execution of his plot, in this case, having the people for an enemy, he must also fear that after his crime is accomplished, thus he is not able to hope for any refuge. So even if he succeeds in the conspiring, he's got to be afraid afterwards because the people might tear him apart. This is true, ladies and gentlemen, isn't it? Of all conspirators. They achieve the conspiracy, but then they got to worry. Look at the great dictators of history. Stalin comes to mind, right? He was pooping in his pants since he took power. And the amount of people he killed to keep power is an amazing statement of cruelty. Numberless instances might be given of this, but I will content myself with one which took place within the memory of our fathers. Messrs. Annibale Bentivogli, the Prince of Bologna, and sister of the present Messrs. Annibale, was killed by Canecchi, who conspired against him. So he's giving an example. He left no relations but Messer Giovanni, who was then an infant, but after the murder of the people, rose up and killed all the Canecchi. This arose from the popular. These were savage people, weren't they? This arose from the popular goodwill that the House of Bentivogli enjoyed at that time. Forgive my pronunciations, I'm not Italian, which was so great that as there was nobody left after the death of Annibale who could govern the state, the Bolognese, hearing that there was one of the Bentivogli family in Florence who had till then been thought the son of the blacksmith, came to fetch him and gave him the government of the city. And it was governed by him until Mrs. Giovanni was old enough to assume the government. You and I don't know what the hell he's talking about. We don't have to know what the hell he's talking about. We have to read this to understand he's giving an example of what he just talked about here. That when you're conspiring and you achieve your conspiracy, you still have to be pooping in your pants because the things you conspired against are still present. So I conclude a prince need trouble little about conspiracies when the people are well disposed. But when they are hostile and they hold you, the prince, in hatred, then he must fear everything and everybody. That's pretty much common sense, isn't it? And if you think the people love you and they don't, you've heard of the emperor's new clothes, right? Well-ordered states and wise princes have studied diligently not to drive the nobles to desperation and to satisfy the populace and keep it contented, for this is one of the most important matters that a prince has to deal with. Among the kingdoms that are well-ordered and governed in our time is France. And there we find numberless good institutions on which depend the liberty and security of the king. And of these, the chief is the parliament, right? And its authority, because he who established that kingdom of France, knowing the ambition and insolence of great nobles, they deemed it necessary to have a bit in their mouths to check them, to keep them under check. You know what a horse has in his mouth to check them from biting, right? The bit. And knowing, on the other hand, that the hatred of the mass of the people against the great, based on fear, and wishing to secure the people, he did not wish to make this the special care of the king, so to relieve him of the dissatisfaction that he might incur among the nobles by favoring the people, and among the people by favoring the nobles, he therefore established a third judge, that without direct charge of the king, have kept in check the great and favored the lesser people. That's the parliament. He put the parliament there. Put something in between him and the king, right? Nor could any better or more prudent measure have been adopted, nor better precaution for the safety of the king and the kingdom. Do you understand what he's saying? Remember how he said this earlier? About when you take over something, you got to either live there or put somebody else in there. So in the case of his example of France, they created the parliament to put a buffer between the king and the people. The king wants to keep the people content. And yet, later on, there was the French Revolution, right? Which is a discussion for another time. From which another notable rule can be drawn. What's the notable rule? That princes should let the carrying out of unpopular duties devolve on others. Don't do it yourself. Let others do it, and bestow favors themselves. Kings should do favors. Princes should do the favors. Let everybody carry out the bad stuff. So I conclude again by saying, a prince must esteem his nobles, but not make himself hated by the populace. There's the rule. Let the people love you. This was a great gift that Queen Elizabeth in England knew. The people were always behind the queen, and she knew that, right? So she had other people around her, Lord Chancellor, right, cardinals. It may seem perhaps to some that considering the life and death of many Roman emperors, that there are instances contrary to my opinion, finding that some who have always lived nobly and showed great strength of character, they nevertheless lost their empire, or they were killed by their subjects who conspired against them. Julius Caesar, right? He got assassinated. Wishing to answer these objections, I will discuss the qualities of some emperors, showing the cause of their ruin not to be at variance with what I've just stated. And I will also, meanwhile, consider the things to be noted by whoever reads the deeds of these times. I will content myself with taking all those emperors who succeeded to the empire, from Marcus, the philosopher, to Maximus. These were Marcus, Commodus, his son, Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, and his son, Pertinax, Julianus, Servus, Antonius, Caracalla, his son, Marcinius, all these, Alexander, and Maximus. That's a lot of Romans, huh? And the first thing to note is that whereas other princes have only to contend against the ambition of the great and the insolence of the people, the Roman emperors had a third difficulty, and that of having to support the cruelty and avarice of the soldiers, which was such that it was the cause of the ruin of many, it being hardly possible to satisfy both the soldiers and the people. For the people love tranquility, and therefore, like pacific princes, but the soldiers prefer a prince of military spirit, who is insolent and cruel and greedy, rapacious. They wish to exercise these qualities on the people so that they may get double pay and give vent to their avarice and cruelty. Thus it came about to those emperors who, by nature or art, had not such a reputation as to keep both parties in check, they were invariably ruined. And the greater number of them who were raised to the empire, being new men, knowing no difficulties of these two opposite dispositions, they confided themselves to satisfying the soldiers, and they thought little of injuring the people. So nobodies don't know that this rule of satisfying the people, but he's saying the Roman emperors had a third problem, which was the soldiers. They had to keep the army paid, fed, right? This choice was necessary, princes not being able to avoid being hated by someone. You're not going to be able to avoid being hated by someone. They must first try not to be hated by the mass of people. If they cannot accomplish this, they must use every means to escape the hatred of the most powerful party. So if you can't avoid being hated, does any example currently come to your mind? If you can't avoid being hated by the people, you should escape the hatred of the most powerful parties. The example I'm coming up in my mind is that there was a certain person who was hated both by the people, theoretically, and by both parties, which was not true. Because as you saw recently, the people did not hate him. And therefore, these emperors, who being new men, and he's not an emperor, new men had need of extraordinary favors. They adhered to the soldiers rather than to the people. Whether this, however, was of use to them or not depended on whether the prince knew how to maintain his reputation with the soldiers. From these causes it resulted that Marcus, Pertinax, and Alexander, being all of modest life, lovers of justice, and enemies of cruelty, humane and benign, they all had to a sad end, except Marcus. Marcus alone lived and died in honor, because he succeeded to the empire by hereditary right and did not owe it either to the soldiers or to the people. Besides which, possessing many virtues which made him revered, he kept both parties in their place as long as he lived, and he was never either hated or despised. But Pertinax was created emperor against the will of the soldiers, who, being accustomed to live licentiously, promiscuously, in sexual matters, under Commodus, could not put up with the honest life to which Pentrax wished to limit them. And so, having made himself hated, and to this contempt being added because he was old, he was ruined at the very beginning of his administration. So Marcus Aurelius, he's saying, was pretty cool. He kept everybody happy. His son Commodus was one way, and then this guy Pentrax, right? Didn't work out because he was a man of honor. Whence it may be seen, look at the arrow, whence it may be seen that hatred is gained as much by good works as by evil. Think about that. Hatred is gained by much good works as evil. And therefore, as I said before, a prince who wishes to maintain the state is often forced to do evil. For when that party, whether populace, soldiery, or nobles, whichever it be that you consider necessary to you for keeping your position, is corrupt, you must follow its humor and satisfy it. And in that case, works will be inimical to you. But let us come to Alexander, who is by of such goodness that in many other things for which he is praised, it is said that in the 14 years that he reigned, no one was put to death by him without a fair trial. Nevertheless, being considered effeminate and a man who allowed himself to be ruled by his mother, and having thus fallen in contempt, the army conspired against him and killed him. Considering, on the other hand, the qualities of Commodus, Servius, Antonius, he's using all these Romans as examples. You will find extreme cruel and rapacious greedy. To satisfy the soldiers, there was no injury which they would not inflict on the people. They would do anything. And all except Servius ended badly. Servius, however, had the abilities that by maintaining the soldiers friendly to him, he was able to reign happily, although he opposed the people. For his virtues made him so admirable in the sight of both the soldiers and the people, that the latter, the people in some degree, astonished and stupefied, while the former were respectful and contented. You can look Servius, Marcus, you can look up all these names on Google and read about them. Machiavelli understands that Lorenzo, being educated, knows about these people. So he's assuming that he doesn't have to, they didn't have Google in those days, right? But they had history, they had oral history, and being nobles, right, being the emperor or princes, they had access to what? Books. Books were only read by the elite. Right? They kept everybody else ignorant. As the deeds of this ruler were great and notable for a new prince, I will briefly show how well he could use the qualities of the fox and the lion, whose natures, I said before, it's necessary for a prince to imitate. So, knowing the sloth of the Emperor Julianus, Servius, who was leader of the army of Slavonia, persuaded his troops that it would be well to go to Rome and avenge the death of Pertinax, who had been slain by the Praetorian Guard. You know, Praetorian Guard was often the guard around the emperor, and if you know your Roman history, right, they slayed one of the great nutcases who was an emperor. Now, why does his name escape me? But it'll come to me before the end of this reading. Let's see, Claudius. It'll come to me. It's not Claudius. It was the guy before Claudius. Under the pretext, without revealing his aspirations to the throne, he marched with his army to Rome and was in Italy before his departure was known. And on his arrival in Rome, the Senate elected him emperor through fear and killed Julianus. And there remained after this beginning two difficulties to be faced by Servius before he could obtain the whole control of the empire. And one in Asia, where Nigerius, head of the Islamic armies, had declared himself emperor, and the other west, Albanius, who also aspired to the empire. And as he judged it dangerous to show himself hostile to both, he decided to attack Nigerius and deceived Albanius, to whom he wrote that having been elected emperor by the Senate, he wished to share the dignity with him, to Albanius. And he sent him the title of Caesar, and by deliberation of the Senate, he was declared his colleague, all of which was accepted as true by Albanius. So when Servius had defeated and killed Nigerius and pacified the East, he came back to Rome and charged Albanius in the Senate with having unmindfully and benefits received from him, traitorously sought to assassinate him, and stated that he was therefore obliged to go and punish this ingratitude. So he went to France to meet him, and there he deprived him both of his position and his life. You see, this is an example of the deception of the lion and the fox that he was talking about. Whoever examines in detail the actions of service will find him to have a very ferocious lion and an extremely astute fox, and they will find him to have been feared and respected by all and not hated by the army. It will not be surprised that he, a new man, new prince, should have been able to hold so much power, since his great reputation defended him always from the hatred that his rapacity might have produced in the people. But Antonius look how rich Niccolo Machiavelli is in the history of Rome. See how much this guy studied and the study of power, how people gain power, how they retain power, how they lose power. You're reading an amazing man, an amazing mind. Even if, ladies and gentlemen, even if you don't agree with this guy, you have to admire his knowledge and his proof. He's not just whistling Dixie. He's not just throwing this stuff out there. He's got facts to back him up. But Antonius, his son, was also a man of great ability, and he possessed qualities that rendered him admirable in the sight of the people and also made him popular with the soldiers. For he was a military man, capable of enduring the most extreme hardships, disdainful of delicate food and every other luxury, which made him loved by all the armies. However, his ferocity and cruelty were so great and so unheard of, through having after executing many private individuals, caused a large part of the population of Rome and all of that of Alexandria to be killed, that he became hated by all the world and began to be feared by those about him to such an extent that he was finally killed by a centurion in the midst of his army. Whence it is to be noted that this kind of death, which proceeds from the deliberate action of a determined man, cannot be avoided by princes, since anyone who does not fear death himself can inflict it. There should be an arrow here. I'm putting an arrow in here now. That's an arrow. Remember this. The deliberate action of a determined man cannot be avoided by the princes, since anyone who does not fear death himself can inflict it. What's it? Death. But a prince need not fear much on this account, as such men are extremely rare. He must only guard against committing any grave injury to anyone he makes use of or has about him for his service, like Antonius had done, having caused the death and the contumely of the brother of that centurion, and also threatened him every day. He killed the centurion's brother, and he threatened him every day, although he still retained him in his bodyguard, which was a foolish and dangerous thing to do, you think? You think? So he kills the centurion's brother. He continually, mocks him, right? Threatens him every day. And yet he retains him in his guard. How stupid is that? But let's come to Commodus, who might have easily have kept the empire, right? And who is he talking about here who got killed? Let's go back for a second. Antonius, his son. Okay. Commodus, who might easily have kept the empire, having succeeded to it by heredity, being the son of Marcus, and it could have sufficed for him to follow in the steps of his father, to have satisfied both the people and the soldiers. But being of a cruel and bestial disposition, if you saw the movie Gladiator, Not that everything in their movie is true, but the way they depict Commodus is pretty close. Is in order to be able to exercise his greediness on the people, he sought to favor the soldiers and render them licentious. On the other hand, by not maintaining his dignity and by often descending into the theater to fight with gladiators and committing other contemptible actions, little worthy of the imperial dignity, he became despicable in the eyes of the soldiers. And being hated on the one hand and despised on the other, he was conspired against and killed. So there remains to be described the character of Maximus. He was an extremely warlike man, and his armies were annoyed by the effeminacy of Alexander, which we have already spoken of. He was elected emperor after the death of the latter, and he did not enjoy it for long, as two things made him hated, Alexander hated and despised. The one, there's a lot of, there was more than one Alexander here, so you got to get your Alexander straight. Two things made this Alexander hated. The one was his base origin, because he was a shepherd in Thrace, which was generally known and caused great disdain on all sides. And the other was because he had a commencement of his own rule, he deferred going to Rome to take possession of the imperial seat. And he obtained a reputation for great cruelty, having through his prefects in Rome and other parts of the empire committed many acts of cruelty. The whole world being thus moved by indignation for the baseness of his blood and also hatred caused by the fears of his ferocity, he was conspired against first by Africa and afterwards by the Senate and all of the people in Rome and Italy, and his own army also joined them. For besieging Aquila and finding it difficult to take, they became enraged at his cruelty, and seeing that he had so many enemies, they feared him less, and they put him to death. I'm not going to speak about Helioglabus, Marcinius, Julianus, who being completely contemptible were immediately suppressed, but I will come to the conclusion of this discourse by saying that princes of our time have less difficulty than these Romans in being obliged to satisfy an extraordinary degree their soldiers in their states. For although they must have a certain consideration for the soldiers, yet any difficulty is soon settled. For none of these princes have armies that are inextricably bound with the administration of the government and the rule of their provinces, as were the armies of the Roman Empire. If it was then necessary to satisfy the soldiers rather than the people, it was because the soldiers could do more than the people. Now it is more necessary for princes, except the Turk and the sultans, to satisfy the people than the soldiers, for the people can do more than the soldiers. I expect the Turk, because he always keeps about him 12,000 infantry and 50,000 cavalry, on which depend the security and the strength of his kingdom. And it is necessary for him, the Turk, to postpone every consideration to keep them friendly. It is the same with the kingdom of the Sultan, which being entirely in the hands of the soldiers, he is bound to keep their friendship, regardless of the people. And it is to be noted that the state of the Sultan is different from all of the other princes, except being similar to the Christian pontificate, which cannot be called either hereditary kingdom or a new one, the Pope. For the sons of the dead prince are not his heirs, but he who is elected to the position by those who have authority, cardinals. And as this order is ancient and cannot be called a new kingdom, there being none of these difficulties which exist in new kingdoms. As although the prince is new, the rules of the state are old and arranged to receive him, the Pope, as if he were a hereditary lord. But returning to our matter, I say that whoever studies the preceding argument will see that either hatred or contempt were the causes of the ruin of the emperor's name. And we'll also observe how it came about, that some of them acting in one way and some in another, in both ways. There were some who had a fortunate and other who had an unfortunate ending. Pentrax and Alexander were both new rulers, and it was useless and injurious for them to try and imitate Marcus, who was a hereditary prince. And similarly, Caracalla, Commodus, and Maximus, it was pernicious for them to imitate Servius, as they had not sufficient ability to follow in his footsteps. Thus, a new prince cannot imitate the actions of Marcus in his dominions, why? Because Marcus is hereditary, nor is it necessary for him to imitate those of Servius. But a new prince must take from Servius those things that are necessary to found his state, and from Marcus those that are useful and glorious for conserving a state that is already established and secure. We're going to stop there, ladies and gentlemen, and continue with chapter 20 in the next final reading. Pernicious is having a harmful effect, especially in a gradual, subtle way, just for your definition, right? You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy, and we've been reading part 7 of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. Aren't you great? Isn't this great? Wow, a lot to think about. We're going into part 8 the next time. Part 8. That's the final part before the analysis, the comprehensive analysis. We might be here for 3 days with the analysis. I'm kidding. Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com is my email. Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com is my email. Please send me an email. Questions, comments, critiques. Hope you're enjoying it. My nose is stuffed. I'm going to have a cup of coffee now. Enjoy your day.